So if anyone is watching on the live class, you need to understand that all of these classes are recorded. We try to make them available for live classes, but sometimes connections can get interrupted. Sometimes there can be problems with the audio. Sometimes the video may cut in and out. We try as best we can to make the video available live, but if it's interrupted at all, make sure you understand that all of these lessons are recorded without those problems, and you can watch them later on. So we'll do the best that we can with live classes, but everything is recorded, so there's really nothing for us to worry about. In this lesson, we're going to begin our second study in Aesop's Fables. And the second fable in our reading is Jupiter and the Camel. Our classes for Aesop's Fables are only 30 minutes because these are simple lessons and we have a class meeting every day. So we're going to cover one fable in each class. Sometimes we may fill a whole 30 minutes because we have a really interesting fable and we have a lot to talk about. Sometimes fables are simpler, the lesson is simple, and we'll get done pretty quickly. I said in our first class that Aesop's Fables is the beginning of our study of moral philosophy. So this is not just some silly kids class. This is not just storybook time. We're not just telling stories to entertain children. That's not what Aesop's Fables are. I explained in our last class that Aesop's Fables are stories that were written by a wise man to teach moral lessons. Aesop's Fables teach us moral lessons. And they use fables, they're fables. Aesop uses fables because fables are easy to understand. They're easy to understand. They're easy to remember. And they affect our emotions. They affect us. The stories have an emotional effect. They're easy to understand, they're easy to remember, and they affect us emotionally. That's why Aesop teaches his moral lessons using fables. And in our first lesson, we said that there was another famous teacher who liked to teach with fables. Jesus Christ used fables or parables to teach his followers. Fables are very effective at teaching us moral lessons. Okay? In our first lesson, I also talked about the fact that fables are simple enough. They're simple enough that young children can understand them and learn from them. Young children can understand and learn from them. But they're not just kids' stories. These are not just stories to entertain children. The fables are philosophical teachings. They're sources of moral philosophy that teach us virtue and vice. They teach us how to be good. And it doesn't matter whether you're 6 years old or 60 years old. It doesn't matter whether you're a young child or an old man. Aesop's Fables are very helpful no matter what your age is. Aesop's fables can teach you. I can study one of Aesop's fables and spend time meditating on it, and I can find it very helpful to me as a 47-year-old man. And a young child can study Aesop's fables and find it very helpful even as a child. These are not simple stories to just entertain children. They're moral fables that teach important moral lessons, and they can teach you different lessons all throughout your life. When you read a fable and you're just 10 years old or 11 years old, you'll read this fable and think about things that are different than you'll think about when you're 20 years old or 30 years old or 50 years old. You're going to find times in your life, if you study Aesop's fables, you're going to find times in your life where you don't know what to do in a certain situation. And Aesop's fables that you remember from when you were a child help you to think about a moral lesson and make a good decision. Okay? So studying these fables is very important for your moral life, whether you're a young child or an old man. Studying these fables when you're young is going to be helpful for you for your whole life. Okay? In our first fable, we studied the fable of the two frogs. We looked at two frogs. We saw that they lived by a lake, and in the hot summer, the lake dried up. They were forced to leave their home to go and look for water. They came to a well. One frog said, "Hey, let's jump in." And the other frog said, "No, wait a bit. We have to think about this. If we jump into this deep well and that dries up, then we're really in trouble." And so we said the moral of our first lesson was to be careful before you make a decision, to look before you leap. Okay? So now we're ready for our second lesson in Aesop's fables. And our second lesson is the story of Jupiter and the camel. I'm going to erase this. The second fable, which we're going to study in this lesson, is the fable of Jupiter and the camel. Before we get started with the fable, let's just make sure we understand what these names mean. Who is Jupiter and what is a camel? We should understand something about these subjects before we get into the fable. Aesop was not a Christian man, and that's not because he rejected Christianity. He wasn't some kind of evil person. He wasn't a foolish unbeliever. Aesop was not a Christian because he lived before Christianity. He was a Greek man who lived in the ancient world before the church was started. He was an ancient Greek, and the ancient Greek people, the ancient Greeks tried to understand about spiritual things by philosophy. They tried to study the things that were made. They tried to study the world. They tried to study themselves to understand whether there was a God or whether there were a number of different gods, whether there were spirits. They tried to understand how the world works, where man came from, what happens to a man when he dies. They tried to understand all of these things by thinking, by reasoning, by studying the world and by studying themselves. And so these ancient people had ideas about gods and goddesses, angels and spirits. They had ideas about these things. And the ancient Greek people, the ancient Roman people also, they believed that a god named Zeus. The ancient Greeks believed in a god named Zeus. The Romans believed in the same god, but they had a different name for him. They named him Jupiter. He was the highest of all the gods, the greatest of the gods. Zeus in Greek, Jupiter in Latin. So you may have heard the name Jupiter before, right? Because it's the name of a planet. This god of the Greeks was not named after the planet was named after the god. Okay? Jupiter, to the Roman people, was the greatest of the gods, and to the Greeks, his name was Zeus. So we can call this fable Jupiter and the camel, or Zeus and the camel, or God and the camel. Because the Greeks didn't know the Christian God, they didn't know the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But this was their idea of God, the creator of the world. Okay, so we could name this fable the fable of God and the camel. All right, because for the Greek people, Jupiter was who they understood to be the greatest of the gods, the great God of all the gods. Okay? So Jupiter is the great god of the ancient people. And then we have a camel. So we have to understand a little bit about a camel. Camels are animals that we don't have in America. You might see one at a zoo, but that's not how a camel really lives, right? Camels don't live in zoos. We actually have a place right around the block with a couple of camels. But they're just kept for show, right? Animals in a zoo are just for show. It's just so visitors can come and see some animals. But that's not how the animals really live. Camels are a strange animal that can live in the desert. And this is what makes camels important. Camels live in the desert. Can a milk cow live in a desert? Can sheep live in a desert? No, right? And men have to travel in places like Africa. Men have to travel across large deserts. They do so for trade and for business. They have to travel across the desert. And it's very difficult for any animals to travel across the desert. But God created camels. God created camels with the ability to travel across the desert. And so they're actually used by men to ride on and to carry things across deserts. And they can do this. They have a number of different special gifts that God gave them that allow them to do this. But one of the reasons why they can do this is because they can go for a long time without needing any water. All right? Their ability to travel across the desert without water makes them very valuable to human beings. Okay? So I want you to think about this. God gave them a special strength. Camels have a special strength. They're able to travel and carry heavy loads for a long time with no water. God gave them that strength, and that strength is what makes them valuable. It's what makes them different from every other animal. And man needs camels because of this strength that they have. And so whenever we talk about a camel, we should think about the strength of a camel. Are camels fast runners? No. Do they jump high? No. Are they beautiful? No. Does any girl grow up and dream of having a camel one day? No. Right? Camels are valuable because of their ability to travel without needing water. That's what makes them valuable to people who live in desert places. All right? Even so that if you read the Old Testament, if you read the Bible, you'll see that when the Bible wants to tell us that a man is wealthy, it tells us that he has a lot of camels. That's a sign of his wealth, how many camels he has. All right? So now that we read the title Jupiter and the Camel, you have an idea what that means, right? Jupiter is the name for God, and a camel is an animal that has a special strength given to it by God. So now let's read the fable of Jupiter and the camel. The camel, once upon a time, complained to Jupiter. The camel complained to Jupiter that he was not as well served as he ought to be in the means of defense and offense. So the camel complained to Jupiter, to God, that God didn't create him as well as he should have. The camel says, the bull has horns. The boar has tusks. The lion and the tiger, they have formidable claws and fangs that make them feared and respected on all sides. So the camel is looking at the other animals and he's saying, look at that bull over there. He's got these big, powerful horns. He's terrifying. Look at the boar. The boar is a male wild hog, pig, okay? Do you ever see an older pig? He starts to grow tusks in his mouth, right? That are sharp and pointy, and he rams stuff and attacks them with his tusks. The camel says, look at the boar. He's got these powerful, sharp tusks to fight off his enemies. Look at the lion and the tiger. They have claws and fangs. All of these animals have all of these weapons to fight with and protect themselves with. And he says, I, on the other hand, have to put up with the abuse of all who choose to insult me. I have no horns. I have no tusks. I have no claws. I have no fangs. And the camel is basically saying, my life stinks. This isn't fair. Why couldn't I be made like the other animals? I have to put up with the abuse of all who choose to insult me. Everybody picks on me, and I can't do anything about it. My life stinks. I don't like the way that God made me. Jupiter, Aesop tells us, Jupiter angrily, so what the camel was complaining about, the camel's complaints made Jupiter angry. Jupiter angrily told him that if he would take the trouble to think, he would see that he was endowed with qualities shared by no other beast. If he would take the trouble to think, he would see that he was endowed with qualities that God gave to no other beast, but only to him. But that as a punishment for his unreasonable importunity, henceforward his ears should be shortened. And so we're told that God made the camel's ears short as a punishment for his complaining. This is the fable of Jupiter and the camel. Now let's think about the details of this story because they're very interesting. First of all, like I said before, the camel was created with a strength that no other animal has, right? And so when God made the camel, God took special interest in the camel and made the camel different from every other beast, every other animal. This is what makes a camel a camel. What makes it different. It doesn't need horns because God created the camel for a purpose. It doesn't need tusks. It doesn't need claws or fangs to do what God created it for. God created the camel to serve a certain purpose, and God gave the camel everything that it needs for that purpose. God gave the camel everything it needs to be a camel. Everything it needs to do God's will, it has. And the camel, if it would think, remember Jupiter says, if you would take the trouble to think, if you would take the trouble to think, you would understand that I've made you special for a special purpose, and you can be happy doing what I created you to do. If you would think about it. So why do we complain? Why does the camel complain? Because he doesn't think about his life. And that's one of the moral lessons in this fable. When we complain about our lives, when we look at other people and we're envious, when we look at how other people are built or what other strengths other people have, we complain about our life when we don't think about our life. All that matters in our lives is that we do what God created us to do. And we'll find, just like the camel, if we think, we'll find that God created us with everything that we need to be happy forever. If we do his will. If we live for the purpose that he created us for. If we live for the purpose that God created us for, we will be happy and we will find that God made us perfect for what he wants us to do. And I can give you an example from my own life. I'll be quick here. When I was a kid, I played sports and I loved sports and I was good at sports. And as I got older, I got into high school sports and I was very successful in sports. But there's one thing that God did not give me. He gave me a strong mind. He gave me a courageous heart. But there's one thing that I wasn't given. I wasn't given big, strong hands. And when I played sports, my best sport was baseball. And my best position in baseball was catcher. I was the catcher. And I was a very good catcher. But when I got to a certain level, my hands started to break. My fingers would break. My bone in my thumb broke. My muscles would tear in my hands. And I got to a point where, when I was 17 years old, I couldn't continue playing baseball because my hands weren't strong enough to be a catcher and to keep playing baseball at the level that I was playing. And I remember being upset because as good as I was in baseball and as much as I wanted to play baseball, my hands were keeping me from being able to play baseball. One time I spent a whole summer where I couldn't play baseball because my thumb broke and I had to have a cast for the summer from playing baseball. And so I had this problem when I was 17 years old where my ability to play baseball was prevented by my hands breaking. I had weak hands. When I played football, I broke my shoulder and I couldn't play football because my shoulder broke. I couldn't play baseball because my hand broke. And when I was a teenager, I was upset because my body wouldn't let me play sports the way that I wanted to play sports. because I was crazy and I liked to play sports very, very hard. I like to play hard and I like to win, but my body just broke. My body wasn't strong enough to play as hard as I wanted to play, and I was upset. But what I learned over time is that it wasn't God's will for me to play sports. And what God wanted me to do in my life, He created me and made me perfect for that work. And if I wanted to keep playing sports, I would have complained like the camel, right? Why did you make me like this? Why didn't you give me this? Why didn't you? And I would have complained. But as I thought about it, I was also good at schoolwork. I was always smart in school. I was smarter than most of my classmates. And to be smart and to study and to do the work that I was good at in school, you don't need a strong body. And over time, I found that what God wanted me to do, my body was created perfectly to do. And I had to learn to not complain. You understand that? Okay? Now, one of the problems that the camel talks about, I want you to pay attention to this. One of the problems that the camel complains about is when God makes you a certain way and He doesn't give you certain strengths, other people can make fun of you, right? Like the lions and the tigers can make fun of you and say, oh, look, you have no teeth, you have no fangs. Look at your wimpy little nails, you have no claws like us. And so you can get made fun of because you don't have certain strengths. But notice what Jupiter told the camel. He needs to think about his life. He needs to think about it and ask himself if it's really important what the other animals say. Does it matter that he doesn't have any claws? Does it matter that he doesn't have fangs? Does it matter that he doesn't have any horns like the bull? No. The bull can't do what the camel can do. A lion and a tiger can't do what a camel can do. A boar can't do what a camel can do. And let me ask you this. What does a man do when he meets with a lion? He kills it. What does a man do when he meets with a tiger? He kills it. How about a wild bull? Kills it. How about a wild boar? He kills it. But what does a man do when he meets with a camel? He keeps it. Because the camel is useful and valuable. And who protects the camel? Man. And man can kill lions, man can kill tigers, man can kill bulls, man can kill boars, and man was intended by God to be the one who defends the camels. And the camel's defender, man, is stronger than all of the defenses of the bull and the boar and the lion and the tiger. The camel does have defense. God did create the camel to be well defended, but He created man to be the camel's defender. The camel doesn't have to defend himself. And the reason why the camel doesn't have to defend himself is because God made the camel valuable to man. God gave the camel a unique strength, a unique purpose, and that purpose made the camel valuable to man who is stronger than all the other beasts. And so did God provide for the defense of the camel? He sure did. But He didn't do it by giving the camel horns or fangs or claws or tusks. He defended the camel by making the camel valuable to man. All right? And what Jupiter says to the camel is, if you would stop complaining and just think about your life, you would see that I've given you things that are even better than the bull and the lion and the boar and the tiger have. I've given you things that are even better, but you don't think. You're unreasonable and you complain. because you don't have this or that or this or that, and you don't need any of those things. You're already safe. What was the camel upset about? Was the camel upset that his life was in danger? No, his life was never in danger. The camel was upset that people insult him. The camel was upset that people make fun of him. And so what did God do to the camel as a punishment? Shortened his ears. What do you think that's going to do to the camel? It's going to give him even more embarrassment. It's going to make people make fun of him even more. So, because the camel was worried about what other people had to say, and he was more worried about what other people say than what God actually says, God actually made him more easily insulted by giving him tiny little ears. But he also may have helped him, because if he has smaller ears, maybe he won't hear their insults as much, right? So maybe God actually did help him by giving him smaller ears. So the camel complained because he was unreasonable. He complained about things, and his complaints made no sense because God already provided for all the things he complained about. And if all he has to worry about is being insulted by other animals, we have to learn that that doesn't matter, right? We have to learn that there's only one person who we have to be concerned with, and that's God himself. God created us for himself. We have to do God's will. And if God is pleased with us, that's all that matters. It doesn't matter what other creatures say. All that matters is what our Creator says. And all we have to do is God's will. We don't have to try to be something that we're not. And if we desire to be something that we're not, that's our own fault. We have to study to learn what God wants us to do. And we'll find that when we find God's will for our life, we'll see that God created us perfectly for his will. And we can be happy. So that's the moral lesson of Jupiter and the camel. So to summarize the moral lesson, right, for your assignment, what is the moral lesson of Jupiter and the camel? The moral lesson is to not complain unreasonably, right? To think before you complain. To understand that all you have to do is God's will, and you're created perfectly to do God's will. That's the moral lesson of Jupiter and the camel. Why did Aesop choose these characters? He chose Jupiter because Jupiter is the creator, right? And he chose the camel because the camel does not have any impressive weapons to defend himself with. And the camel has a special strength that makes him valuable and able to do God's will. That's why God chose Aesop. That's why Aesop chose Jupiter and the camel. And how can we apply this fable to our lives? How can we apply this fable to our lives? We can learn that whenever we're complaining about our life, we're probably not thinking about what we're complaining about. And that's what's bad about thinking. People who complain don't think. They just complain. They just react to things. We can apply this by thinking before we complain, and by asking ourselves, what does God actually want us to do? What does God actually want me to do? Because that's all that matters. And if I do that, I can be happy. And it doesn't matter what anybody else says. In the Catechism, we learn, why did God make us? Why did God make us? God made us to know him, to love him, and to serve him. Did God make us to serve other people? Did God make us to serve our own desires? No, God made us to serve Him. In this life, it's temporary. And to be happy with Him forever in the next. So that's the fable of Jupiter and the camel, and that's the end of our second lesson in Aesop's fables.